Hal. Good to see you. Let's get straight into the news. There's a lot to talk about here. Reuters reports that Russia and China are considering putting a nuclear power plant on the moon from 2033 to 2035. That's according to Russia's space agency, who spoke today. What good is a power plant on the moon?
Well, Austin, actually, when you get into space and the ability to, basically make electrical power in space, there aren't a whole lot of options. And there have been satellites in the past that have been powered by nuclear generators. In fact, there was one very famous a few decades back where it actually crashed into the ocean. Fortunately, but it actually had a small nuclear reactor on board as a Russian satellite. So this is an issue that comes up. Most of our satellites and most of the things we send up are all planned to use solar power, but some of the interplanetary, I should say, probes and stuff that we've looked at, nuclear does come up as a possible option. And certainly, if you're looking at putting a permanent base on the moon, nuclear comes up as an option many times. I don't think this violates the treaty, the space treaty of 1967, talking about putting nuclear weapons in space. I don't see where this would, but obviously anytime you talk about nuclear power in space, it gets the whole world's attention because we're certainly concerned, particularly with China and Russia both being nuclear weapons powers, not just peaceful nuclear means powers, that possibly this could migrate into something more than just a power plant.
Why Russia and China together? Would Russia or China not be able to do this if they were to act alone?
Austin, that's a great question. And the reason why is Russia does have a lot of capability in terms of putting heavier craft in space. They have a long history on this. And so they have an ability. We leveraged their ability for many, many years, which is now certainly with SpaceX is kind of going by the wayside. But we used them for many years to put basically our astronauts and other countries did on the International Space Station. However, China is in the space race. China is launching satellites into space, and China is certainly looking at maybe somehow dovetailing off some of the advanced capabilities that the Russians have in order to do more. Russia also has a lot of very smart engineers and scientists that could help China in its space endeavors.
So is this something that could one day allow lunar settlements to be built? I mean, we're talking maybe civilian stuff.
At some point, I think most of the big countries in the world want to have a more permanent presence on the moon. Now, whether that's a settlement or not, it depends on how long you think a settlement would be for. Now, certainly the moon's gravity is much, much less than on Earth. And for that reason, you wouldn't have astronauts, or in the case of Russia, cosmonauts, up there for an extended period of time because, well, frankly, there's a limitation as to how long they can live in that environment before they start to suffer serious biological consequences of the low gravity. That's something that hasn't been really researched as well as the research in zero gravity, but there is some extrapolation that can be done on that to figure out what that is. However, there is talk of putting a manned presence on the moon for months, potentially, much like we have a manned presence in space for months, and that would be a more permanent settlement.
Russian officials say that Moscow is able to contribute to this partnership with its expertise on, quote, nuclear space energy. Hal, what kind of expertise does Russia have on nuclear space energy at this point?
Well, they have done a lot of work in looking at nuclear-powered rockets for a number of years. I mentioned to you that they had nuclear reactors on at least one or more satellites that I'm aware of that they used during the Cold War period. I don't know about since. So they do have a lot of expertise in this area. These are things that China, instead of having to develop it on their own, they can go in and work with Russia on this. I am sure that with this, there is some sort of quid pro quo. China is providing, they're the number one ally, if you will, the biggest ally that Russia has. And whereas they certainly overtly say they don't send weapons or ammunition over to Russia, behind the scenes, and certainly in other areas, aside from actual direct military application, they're very much a supporter of Russia in this time of war and keeping Russia afloat. Russia has some need to reciprocate. Russia doesn't have a whole lot of ways to reciprocate. This is one of those areas where Russia can reciprocate and say, hey, we'll work with you on this because we've done a lot of advanced research on this over the decades, and you can dovetail and work with us on this. And of course, talk about that expertise thing that we talked about earlier. So that is one way that they can work together. This has kind of been a one-way street in many ways, though. China has a lot of capability. Russia doesn't have much. They have raw resources, they have oil, they have natural gas, they have certain minerals. But in terms of things that they produce beyond the raw material side, they're rather anemic in that regard, whereas China is this huge industrial powerhouse. So this is something where Russia can step in a different area and provide maybe a more meaningful quid pro quo relationship with China.
Moving away from the moon, but keeping with Russia, here's another headline that came out. The Associated Press reporting that on the day that Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was laid to rest in Moscow, Russian state media leaked an audio recording of German military officers discussing the hypothetical use of Taurus long-range missiles in Ukraine. Hal, what does this say about the security of Germany's communications? Or maybe the better question is, what does it say about the intelligence capabilities of the Russians?
Well, it says one thing. If you're on an open line, presume the Russians are listening in. Apparently, what just came out today is that one of the German officers on the call, and it was a conference call, even though it's supposed to be on a secure line, called in on an unsecure line, which means it wasn't one with that was used crypto to protect it in terms of what they're doing. There's secure lines are ones where you're capable of actually talking in a classified format up to a certain level. And apparently someone called in on that line and it was unsecure. And that is how the Russians or whomever that eventually got to the Russians intercepted the call, intercepted the conversation. Of course, for the Germans, this is extremely embarrassing. They just had a vote, in their parliament that said we're not going to send Taurus cruise missiles to Russia, to Ukraine. Because of the fear that Ukraine might use them against sovereign Russian territorial targets. With that said, most of the thinking was that it's just going to take time for the Germans to kind of work through this politically. Eventually, they will decide to send Taurus cruise missiles, as have France and the U.S. decide to send a number of missiles that we originally said we weren't going to send, and then we did send. We figured the Germans are working through the same thing. Now this crops up, and you have senior German officers, to include at least one or more general officers, openly discussing the use of Taurus cruise missiles in Russia, right on the hills of that vote. And it's somewhat politically embarrassing. It's politically embarrassing for Germany. It's embarrassing for NATO across the whole, but it also adds a certain dynamic to whatever political discussion is happening in Germany going forward, because now that all the members of parliament basically know that even though they voted this down, apparently the German military is openly discussing the day when Taurus missiles might be used by Ukraine against Russian forces.
Missiles? I'm just curious, what are Taurus missiles and why? What would make them significant in the battle?
Well, they're a cruise missile. They're a little bit longer range. Cruise missile. It's one of those things that they can. One of the things they were talking about in the call was that they could launch those from Su-24. Those are Russian fighter bombers that the Ukrainians inherited from Russia. Going way back when, you're talking about 3 decades ago. They could also be launched from F-16s, which are coming in sometime in late spring or early summer. At least we hope they are. And so that was the technical parameters of a lot of the discussion, as I understand what was going on. The thing is that Taurus missiles are not going in. Now, Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom, a commensurate, a variant missile, which is pretty much the same thing, from France, and of course, a variety of missiles from the United States, most of which can be launched from the HIMARS system. That's a mobile multiple launch rocket system that we have over there, that we have provided them, that they have over there, I should say. These missiles have been provided. So what it did was it had a political connotation within Germany, within the current discussion. It has a security connotation, which is the Russians picked up on this or got it somehow, and which means the communications were intercepted. And then, of course, for NATO as a whole, it brings up a lot of questions in terms of how things are being done. And it brings up questions about other, which is if the Russians were able to intercept this conversation, what else might they know that they decide not to put out there publicly to embarrass a NATO member? And it kind of reinforces the need for security across the board in everything dealing with Ukraine.
Is this creating tension between Germany and Russia?
I don't know if you could have any more tension between Germany and Russia than you have right now. I mean, there is no love lost between Germany and Russia. At the very beginning of the war, there was, a certain amount of German reticence to get pulled into this thing any more than they were. And you may remember the first thing that the Germans sent over there was 4,000 helmets, which in comparison to the need of Ukraine, the situation on the ground, and what other countries were sending in, certainly wasn't the most difficult decision to make to send 4,000 helmets. We would have preferred they'd start talking Leopard 2 tanks at that time, but it took them a while to get there. So with that, at this point, with the amount of weapons going in there, and certainly the plethora of not just Leopard 2 but Leopard 1 tanks, and a variety of other weapon systems and ammunition that Germany has sent in, and Germany's public position on this, there's already a very tense situation between Germany and Russia. There's a very tense situation between NATO, all NATO countries, and Russia. And certainly Russia reciprocates by saying we're looking at using nuclear weapons in the future. I mean, basically threatening nuclear Armageddon about every other week. So, yeah, it's pretty tense right now. I don't know if it makes it any more tense.
So lastly, Hal, let's touch on the Russia-Ukraine war. I do want to talk about the Black Sea. Ukrainian sea drones hit and sank a Russian Black Sea Fleet patrol ship off of occupied Crimea in an overnight attack, the Ukrainian military said today. Hal, you and I have spoke at length about some of the surprising wins that Ukraine has had in the Black Sea, but let me come at this from a different angle this time. How important is the Black Sea in the scope of this entire conflict?
It is huge, and that is where most of the Russian oil that gets sent by sea goes through. It comes out of the Black Sea ports and goes down through the Dardanelles, through what Turkey calls the Turkish Straits. Everybody else calls the Dardanelles or the Bosphorus, but anyway, but it goes through those straits and then it goes out to the Mediterranean to the rest of the world. It is the Black Sea is the one area that doesn't freeze up in the winter, and you get into Russia situation here. Russia does not have very many ports that don't freeze. If you go to the Pacific and Vladivostok, there's freezing. If you go to certainly up to the Arctic in the wintertime, those ports freeze in and it's tough to get stuff in and out. If you go to the Baltic, those ports freeze in, and certainly with Sweden becoming a member of NATO and Finland having just become a member of NATO, the Baltic Sea is starting to be referred to as the NATO lake because of so many NATO members basically controlling that whole area. So it makes the Black Sea very important. This is what's critical with the Black Sea. Not only did they manage to defeat the Russian blockade of Ukraine, they've done it without any serious naval surface ships. They've done it with things like sea drones, if you will, surface drones like the one that reportedly hit this patrol ship. And they've used it with aerial drones. They've done it with a variety of other weapon systems, but they don't have a navy. As of the morning of March 5th, Ukrainian intelligence is reporting that there are no Russian ships in the Black Sea. I can't recall any time in history where there weren't Russian ships in the Black Sea as long as there's been a Russia. So that is fairly significant that Ukraine, a country without a navy, has so decisively defeated Russia in a maritime confrontation that there's no Russian ships in the Black Sea. I just find that an absolutely amazing statistic. That will probably change tomorrow, but just the fact that there was a period where there were no ships in there tells you how effective some of these asymmetric means are, such as using ocean-going or sea-going drones, surface drones, subsurface drones potentially, and airborne drones in this new type of hybrid warfare that we're dealing with today.
Al Kempfer, we'll leave it there for now. Take care.
All right, thank you, Austin.